I still think about that night sometimes, the one that started out so normal it almost felt boring. I had gone camping with two friends just outside of town, in a spot we'd been to a few times before. It wasn't a popular area for campers because it was rough terrain, mostly dry bushland with uneven ground and thick scrub that reached up to your knees. The track that led there wasn't official, just a narrow trail used by the occasional hiker or hunter. You had to rely on faint markings on trees and patches of trampled grass to stay on course. It always felt remote enough that when you reached the clearing where we usually camped, you felt completely shut off from everything. No signal, no noise from roads, no glow of city lights, just a thin line of stars overhead and the sound of insects in the grass. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up our tents while the sun sank low behind the hills. The air was dry and still, that kind of silence that makes you hear every small thing. Your boots scuffing the dirt, your tent poles snapping together, even the faint hum of flies somewhere nearby. By the time we built a small fire and cooked dinner, the sky was already dark. We sat around, talking about nothing in particular, letting the heat of the flames keep the chill away. At some point, maybe an hour or two after sunset, I got up to stretch my legs. The fire had burned down to a low orange glow, and I decided to walk a little away from the clearing just to get a view of the stars. I followed a faint track up a small rise behind our tents, maybe 50 or 60 meters away. From there, I could see a bit of the surrounding land. A stretch of open bush, low scrub, and the dark shapes of trees scattered like shadows across the ridge. Everything was quiet. I could hear my friends faintly talking near the fire, their voices blending with the crackling sound. Then I noticed movement. It was faint, just at the edge of the ridge ahead. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my eyes adjusting to the dark. But then I saw it again, someone walking through the scrub. I froze for a moment, thinking it might have been another camper or hiker, but there were no other campsites nearby. The person moved strangely, almost stiffly, their pace slow and deliberate. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see them clearly, so I stood there watching, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As they moved closer, I realized it was a man. He came into the faint moonlight, and that's when I noticed something off. His clothes didn't make sense. He was wearing an odd mix of things, like someone had put together an outfit without understanding how they were supposed to go together. A long coat that looked heavy for the weather, tall black boots, a wide hat, and what looked like dress pants tucked awkwardly into the boots. It reminded me of how those fictional characters in movies or books might imagine normal clothing without actually knowing what people wear. The man stopped briefly and looked around before continuing, heading toward the direction of our camp. I couldn't tell if he'd seen me or not, but I stepped back behind a tree, just to be safe. There was something about the way he moved that made my stomach tighten. He didn't seem lost exactly, more like he knew where he was going, which somehow made it worse. I waited until he passed below the ridge and disappeared behind some trees. I could still hear faint crunching sounds of his boots on the dry ground. I backed down slowly toward our camp and saw my friends still by the fire, unaware. I didn't say anything, but I kept glancing out toward the dark edges of the clearing, expecting to see him emerge. About 10 minutes passed before anything happened. Then, from the direction I'd seen him walking, a figure appeared at the edge of the firelight. He stopped just beyond the glow, standing there silently. The firelight flickered over him just enough for me to see that same strange outfit. The coat buttoned up high, the pants tucked into boots, the wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He didn't have a pack or flashlight, nothing to suggest he was camping. He just stood there for a moment, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. The fire cracked loudly, and I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. My friends finally noticed him too, and for a moment nobody moved. Felt like the air had gone heavy. Then, just as quietly as he appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness without a word. His footsteps faded quickly. None of us said anything for a while. We kept listening, waiting for the sound of him coming back, but there was nothing. Eventually, one of my friends stirred the fire and threw on more wood. The flames got brighter, pushing the darkness back a little, but the unease didn't fade. The rest of the night felt long. Every sound from the bush, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch, made us all sit up and look. When morning came, we packed up early. The sunlight made everything feel almost normal again, but the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. Before leaving, I walked a bit in the direction the man had come from, just to see if there were any signs of another camp. The ground was covered in dry leaves and grass, no clear footprints or tire tracks. But about 50 meters out, near a line of low trees, I found what looked like a small patch of disturbed ground. It wasn't a campsite, more like a spot where someone had stood for a while, shuffling their boots into the dirt. Beside it, half covered by leaves, was a single glove. Black leather, old and cracked, like something from decades ago. I didn't touch it. I just stood there looking at it, that same uncomfortable feeling tightening in my chest. I couldn't understand what someone dressed like that was doing out there. There were no roads close by, no easy way in or out of the bush except the trail we used. He hadn't had a pack, no water, no tent, no signs of gear. Nothing about him fit. On the way back, I kept replaying the image of him standing at the edge of the firelight. The way he looked, out of place, wrong somehow, like he'd stepped out of another time. It reminded me of how people in old photos used to dress. Those long coats and odd hats that didn't belong in the Australian bush. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was unnerving. It felt like he'd been watching, or waiting, or just observing us for reasons I couldn't make sense of. When we finally reached the car, the day had already grown hot. The car park was empty, the dirt lot silent except for the wind. There were no other vehicles there, no footprints around. We loaded our gear quickly and left without talking much. That night, I sat on my porch and tried to reason it out. Maybe he was just some eccentric hiker, or someone living off-grid who liked to wander. Maybe he had a camp somewhere deeper in the bush that we couldn't see. But the thing that kept bothering me was how clean he'd looked. His clothes weren't torn or dusty. His boots looked polished. Even from a distance, he didn't move like someone used to walking that kind of rough ground. It's been a while since that trip, but every now and then I think back to that night. The sight of him standing there, perfectly still, dressed like he didn't belong to that place or that time. Maybe there's an explanation, something simple that makes sense, but I've gone over it in my head too many times, and it never quite fits. All I know is that out there, in the middle of nowhere, with only the fire lighting up a small circle around us, we saw a man who looked like he'd stepped out of another world. Not in a magical way, not like a fantasy, but in the real, unsettling way that happens when something just doesn't add up. He walked out of the dark, stood there long enough for us to see him, then disappeared again without a trace. And somehow, that was worse than anything else that could have happened because he was real, and we never found out who he was, where he came from, or why he was there at all. It was early autumn when I went camping at a small, quiet campground just outside of town. It was the kind of place families went on weekends. Nothing remote or wild, just a maintained area surrounded by thick woods, a few trails, and a small lake nearby. I'd gone alone, wanting a few days of quiet after a stressful month. The air had that cool, dry feel of the season changing, and the forest floor was covered in crisp leaves that crunched under every step. I set up my tent in a shaded spot a little away from the main area but still within sight of the trail. There were a few other campers scattered around. Families, a couple of older hikers, and a group of kids fishing near the lake. It all felt safe and normal, the kind of place where nothing strange ever happens. That first day, I spent most of my time walking the nearby trails. They weren't difficult, just long winding paths through dense patches of trees where the light came through in broken beams. You could hear the occasional bird, the rustle of something small in the leaves, and sometimes the faint voices of other hikers far away. The trails weren't marked too well, and in some areas you had to pay attention or you'd end up looping back or wandering off into unkept paths. I was maybe 2 hours into one of those hikes when I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a stick, or at least that's what I thought it was at first glance. It was lying across the ground just off the side of the trail. What caught my attention was how smooth it looked compared to the rough, natural wood around it. When I got closer, I realized it wasn't just some branch someone had whittled down. It was detailed. It was carved into a shape, and not just any shape, it was unmistakably carved into the form of a penis. A big one. It was about 2.5 feet long, thick, smooth, and polished like someone had spent a long time working on it. The base of it was flattened so it could rest upright if placed on the ground, and the detail was absurd. Someone had taken their time with it. It wasn't a joke carving. It was an actual sculpture. Along one side, carved neatly into the wood, were the words "fuck stick." The letters were burned in, not scratched. Someone had used a hot tool to make them, carefully and evenly. I just stood there staring at it for a while, half laughing in disbelief but also weirdly unsettled. It was so out of place. This was a family campground. There were kids nearby, parents, people out for walks. And here, right off the trail, was this elaborate wooden sex sculpture lying like it had just been dropped there. It wasn't old either. The wood still looked fresh, the polish shiny, no moss or wear on it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone had carried it out there. It wasn't small or light. Whoever made it had hauled it into the woods for some reason. I picked it up briefly. It was solid, heavy, and smooth as glass. It wasn't something made as a joke by some drunk campers. It had too much effort in it. I put it back exactly where I found it and kept walking, though I couldn't stop thinking about it. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt, and not because of the object itself, but because it didn't make sense. Why there? Why like that? When I got back to the campground later that afternoon, I stopped by the small ranger station at the edge of the lot. The ranger on duty was an older guy, sun-weathered skin, quiet sort of presence. I told him what I'd found, half expecting him to laugh. He didn't. He just nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. He said something about there being odd groups that had been in the area over the years, hippie types who used to camp out deep in the woods. They were known for making strange carvings and leaving them around. Some kind of back-to-nature group, he said, who took things a little too far. They used to carve symbols, as he called them, and sometimes used them in rituals. Not dangerous, just strange. He mentioned they'd even found carvings nailed to trees before. He didn't say much more, but his tone was serious, not joking. That stuck with me more than anything. That night, back at my site, I couldn't relax the same way I had before. Every sound out in the trees made me glance over my shoulder. The woods around me were dark, thick, and full of quiet shifting noises that made it hard to tell what was near and what was far away. I kept picturing that piece of wood lying out there, freshly carved, too deliberate to be random. When I finally got into my tent, I left the lantern on for a while. The ground outside was silent except for the occasional crack of a branch. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up to a sound that made my stomach tighten instantly. It was faint, distant, but real. A dull thumping noise, spaced evenly, coming from somewhere out in the woods. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but it had rhythm, like something hitting wood. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the sound itself. I waited, holding still, listening. A few minutes passed before I heard another faint noise. Something moving through the brush, slow, dragging, then stopping again. I didn't move. I lay there listening for what felt like an hour, but it never came closer. Eventually, everything went quiet again, and I forced myself to fall back asleep. In the morning, the air was cold and damp. I walked out toward the edge of the trail again, mostly to convince myself that it had just been animals or wind. I went to where I'd found the carved stick, but it was gone. The spot was empty. The ground was disturbed slightly, the leaves shifted, but there was no sign of the carving. That unsettled me more than anything. It had been heavy, too heavy to have just rolled away or been taken by an animal. Someone had picked it up and moved it. I walked a little further down the trail, looking around the trees, the undergrowth, but I didn't see anything else unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was just that instinct that crawls up your back when you know something isn't right. I packed up my camp early that day. As I was rolling my tent, the ranger came by on his ATV. He nodded at me, asked if everything was fine, and then mentioned they'd found another carving near one of the picnic areas that morning. He didn't elaborate, but I didn't ask. I just said I was heading out. Driving away, the woods looked calm, ordinary, like any other quiet stretch of trees. But that feeling stayed with me, the knowledge that somewhere in there, someone was still carving things, still leaving them behind, still watching enough to know when something they made had been touched. I haven't gone back to that campground since. I've gone hiking plenty of times since then, but never there. It wasn't what I found that bothered me the most. It was the fact that someone was out there doing it deliberately. Someone spending hours carving those things by hand, then leaving them near family trails, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. It made me realize that not everything strange in the woods comes from nature. Sometimes it's just people with ideas and rituals and habits you'll never fully understand. The kind of people who spend their nights carving things deep in the trees while everyone else is asleep. And the weirdest part is that whoever made that one I found, they came back for it. They knew exactly where it was. I'd gone camping plenty of times before, but always with friends or family. I liked the quiet, but I also liked knowing there were other people close by. This time, though, I wanted something different. Real solitude, no distractions, just me in the woods. It was something I'd seen others describe on those same Reddit threads. How freeing and peaceful it was to be totally alone in nature. That idea stuck with me for a while. I thought it would be good for me. A few days without my phone, without noise, just quiet and stillness. I picked a small state forest about 2 hours from where I lived in Pennsylvania. It wasn't far, but it was remote enough that I knew I'd have space to myself. The drive out there was beautiful. Long stretches of road through green hills and farmland before the forest began to rise around me. I stopped at the ranger station to check in and was told that only one other person had reserved a site that weekend, somewhere a few miles away. That made me feel even better. I wanted to be completely alone, but knowing someone else was out there somewhere was oddly comforting. The hike to my site was about 3 miles, mostly uphill. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against you. I could hear every twig snap under my boots and the faint sound of my breathing. The site itself was simple: a fire ring, a flat patch of dirt for a tent, and a small clearing that looked down toward a shallow ravine where a creek ran through. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a small dinner as the sun started to go down. Everything felt perfect. As night came on, the woods turned pitch dark, and the sounds of insects filled the air. I sat by the fire for a long time, just staring into it. The smell of smoke and pine mixed together in that way that makes you feel deeply calm. I remember thinking about all those creepy Reddit stories and how, in the moment, I couldn't imagine being scared here. The firelight made the trees around me glow faintly, and everything felt still. I stayed up until the fire burned low and then crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay there listening to the faint sound of the creek below. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It was the kind of waking where you don't really know why you're awake. Not a sound or a dream, just a sense that something's different. My tent was completely dark. I could hear the woods, but it was different from before. The insects had quieted down, and there was a low wind moving through the trees. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke again, it was early dawn. The light through the trees was faint, soft gray, and everything was still damp from the night. I got up, stretched, and went down to the creek to wash my face. That's when I noticed something strange. Across the creek, maybe 30 yards away, there was a flat area where someone had clearly been camping before. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. There were marks in the dirt like something heavy had been sitting there, maybe a tent, and a small ring of stones that looked like another fire pit. It looked abandoned but recent. There were even boot prints in the mud near the edge of the water, deep and sharp. It wasn't that weird on its own. Plenty of people camp out here, and it's not unusual for sites to overlap. But what caught my eye was a long, torn piece of fabric tangled in a bush nearby. It looked like tent material, thin, waterproof nylon, light gray, torn unevenly at the edge. It didn't look old. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, thinking maybe someone had left in a hurry or packed up carelessly. I didn't feel scared yet, just unsettled. After breakfast, I decided to follow the creek downstream for a while. I left my backpack behind and just walked with a bottle of water and my phone in my pocket. The creek wound through the woods for maybe half a mile before the terrain started to dip lower, and the ground became rocky and uneven. That's where I noticed more prints. Boot prints again, deeper now, leading away from the water and up toward a dense section of trees. They weren't mine. They were too wide and long, spaced farther apart. I stopped and crouched down, looking at them closely. There were at least 2 different sets, overlapping each other in the mud. They looked recent. My stomach tightened a little. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since arriving. It didn't make sense that people had been this close without me noticing. I followed the prints for maybe another 50 yards before they just stopped. The ground turned rocky, and the pattern disappeared. The woods were quiet again, unnaturally so. I stood there, feeling the weight of that silence pressing down. I remember how my heart started to beat a little faster. Not panic yet, but alertness. Every sound felt sharper. I turned around and started heading back toward my camp. The walk felt longer this time. Every few minutes, I'd glance behind me, feeling like I was being watched. Nothing moved, but that feeling didn't fade. By the time I got back, the sky had started to cloud over, and the light dimmed to that dull gray that comes before rain. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. I tried to read, tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept circling back to those prints and that torn tent fabric. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe old footprints, maybe a hunter or a hiker passing through. But as the day dragged on, I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't see or hear anyone the entire time, but I couldn't help the sense that someone else was nearby. That night, I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep much. The wind picked up around midnight, and the trees started to creak. My tent shifted slightly with each gust. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the wind. It was faint but distinct, like the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. It came from somewhere down the slope, near the creek. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate. Then it stopped. The woods went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, though it was probably just a few minutes. My mind raced through every possibility. An animal, a branch falling, another camper. But deep down, I knew what footsteps sound like. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I didn't hear anything else that night. When morning came, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. The air was cool and heavy, the sky pale and flat. I kept glancing down toward the creek as I broke camp, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. When I finally started back down the trail, I felt that same alertness from before, that instinct that something wasn't right. I didn't stop to rest. I just kept walking until I reached the parking lot. My car was the only one there. I loaded everything, sat in the driver's seat for a minute, and just let the silence of the car sink in. On the way home, I kept replaying the night in my head. The prints, the torn fabric, the footsteps. It all could have been nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. Felt like someone had been close, watching, maybe, waiting. That was almost a year ago. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still read those creepy Reddit threads, though. I scroll through the comments late at night, just like I used to. But now, whenever someone describes that feeling, the quiet, the sense that the woods are too still, that something's just out of sight, I don't think it's an exaggeration anymore. I know exactly what that feels like. And it's not just creepy, it's real. I was in Montana that summer, camping and hiking through one of those huge, wild stretches of land where you can walk for hours and never see another person. The kind of place that reminds you just how small you really are. It was early in the season, late May maybe, and the snowmelt was still running off the mountains, feeding every creek and river until they were loud and cold enough to numb your hands in seconds. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt, and everything seemed alive after winter. I had been through a few parts of Montana before, but never this deep. It was beautiful, in a harsh way that didn't let you forget that if something went wrong out there, it might be a long time before anyone found you. We'd set up camp near a Forest Service road not far from the mountains. The plan was to hike during the day, fish a few streams, and then camp near the truck each night. Nothing crazy. There were 2 of us, me and a friend I'd known since high school. And that morning, we packed light and decided to explore a new section of the park. Before heading out, we ran into a park ranger checking the trail maps near a small station. He looked friendly enough, and we figured we'd ask for his opinion on which way to go. He pointed down toward a valley in the distance, said it was beautiful, quiet, not many people went down that way. From where we were standing, it looked incredible. Long stretches of green broken up by dark forest and a stream that wound through the middle. The kind of place you see in travel magazines. Without thinking much about it, we thanked him and started heading that direction. The trail began as a gentle descent through pine forest, soft ground underfoot, sunlight filtering through the trees in thin lines. For the first hour or two, it was perfect. The kind of hike that makes you forget time. We stopped occasionally to drink water, check our map, and take in the view of the valley slowly opening below us. The air was still, warm but not hot, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. As we kept going, the valley started to narrow. The slopes on both sides rose higher and steeper, the trees growing denser. The easy feeling of the first stretch began to fade. The path wound deeper into a place that felt more closed in, more hidden from everything else. The sound of the wind stopped reaching us, replaced by an eerie kind of quiet. It was the sort of silence that presses on your ears, where even your own footsteps sound too loud. After a while, I started noticing small things that felt off. The trail was getting rougher, like it hadn't been used much. There were broken branches, overturned rocks, and patches of dirt that looked disturbed. Not like human footprints, but something else. I brushed it off at first. Out there, animals were everywhere. Still, the deeper we went, the tighter the valley got. The walls rose up like cliffs, and the trees thinned out, leaving us more exposed. It started to feel like walking down a tunnel made of stone and grass. About 2 hours in, we reached a clearing. It was open, flat, and stretched for maybe 50 yards before the trees picked back up on the other side. The sunlight was bright there, glaring off the tall grass and small patches of wildflowers. At first glance, it looked peaceful. One of those hidden meadows that almost makes you want to sit down and rest for a while. But as soon as I stepped out into it, my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. The grass ahead of us was flattened, not like from wind or people walking. It looked like something massive had come through. There were deep, wide tracks, like an invisible pickup truck had plowed straight through the clearing, bending everything in its path. I crouched down to get a closer look and felt my chest tighten even more. The marks weren't from a vehicle. They were from something alive. The flattened grass was packed down unevenly, and in some spots you could see claw impressions in the dirt. Huge ones. For a second, everything inside me went cold. I realized what I was looking at. Bear sign. Not just a wandering bear either. This was something big, powerful. And there wasn't just one path of flattened grass. There were several, crossing and weaving through the clearing, some fresh, some older. It looked like animals had been moving back and forth here for a long time. I felt that instinctive kind of fear that doesn't need to be explained. The air smelled different now, heavy, musky, like damp fur and old earth. The trees at the edge of the clearing had long claw marks on them. Two, the kind that reach high up the trunks, higher than I could reach even if I stretched. I didn't have to think hard to know what this was. This was bear country. Later, we found out from someone back at the ranger station that the valley we'd gone down into was called the Nursery. That name made sense after the fact, but standing there in that clearing, all I knew was that every instinct I had was screaming to leave. Grizzly bears use places like that, remote, quiet valleys, to raise their cubs. A safe place for mothers and their young. But that also makes it one of the most dangerous spots a person can stumble into. There's nothing more aggressive, more unpredictable, than a mother grizzly protecting her cubs. The realization hit me fast. We were deep in a narrow valley, miles from the car, surrounded by cliffs on both sides, with almost no visibility ahead. The path that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap. I looked up and scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between shadows, convinced I was being watched. The wind had picked up just enough to make the grass shift, and every small sound made my heart jolt. I turned back the way we came. The trail suddenly looked different, darker, tighter, like it had closed up behind us. Every step back felt heavy, like I was waiting for something to move behind me. I started talking loudly, not words, just noise, to make sure any animal nearby knew we were there. People say grizzlies will usually avoid humans if they hear them coming, and I clung to that thought like a lifeline. The hike out felt 10 times longer than the way in. I kept scanning the trees, the cliffs, the ground. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I imagined shapes between the trunks, brown fur, movement, eyes watching. The valley echoed our footsteps in strange ways, making it sound like something was pacing us from far off. I knew it was probably my mind playing tricks, but it didn't matter. My body stayed tense, ready to run or climb or do something if it came to that. By the time we reached the wider section of the trail again, my throat was dry and my legs felt like they were made of lead. When I finally saw the outline of the forest opening up toward where we'd started that morning, I felt the kind of relief that you only get when you know you've avoided something serious. Back at the top, I looked back into the valley one last time. From up there, it looked harmless again. Just a stretch of green between two ridges, sunlight catching the tops of the trees. You'd never know what was waiting down there. You'd never guess how fast beauty can turn into danger in a place like that. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I couldn't shake the image of those flattened trails in the grass. The way they crossed each other like roads, the quiet weight of that place. I kept thinking about how close we might have been to walking right into something we couldn't have walked out of. Montana is beautiful, but it's not forgiving. Out there, things happen fast, and if you're not paying attention, the land will remind you that you're just a visitor. That valley taught me that in a way I'll never forget. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel that cold, heavy fear again, the kind that tells you you've stepped somewhere you don't belong. In his defense, there hadn't been any recent attacks, and it was, in fact, the coolest path. That's what the ranger said when we asked which trail would be the best one to camp along for a couple of nights. We were in Montana, somewhere near the Ozarka Range, surrounded by high ridges and valleys that looked like something out of a nature documentary. The air had that clean, almost sharp kind of freshness you only get out there, and the sky looked endless. When the ranger pointed down toward a valley, I remember thinking it looked peaceful, green, and inviting. We didn't think twice about it. We just packed up, tightened the straps on our backpacks, and started hiking down into the valley. At first, it was perfect, the kind of scenery that makes you forget about everything else. The trees were tall and spaced just enough to let light through in those golden streaks that make everything look softer. There was a small stream that followed along the trail for a while, and the sound of it made the whole place feel calm. After maybe an hour or two, I noticed how the valley started to change. The path narrowed, and the slopes on both sides began to rise higher. The cliffs went from distant ridgelines to towering walls that closed in more with every turn. The trees grew thinner, and the air lost that gentle breeze it had earlier. It got quiet, not peaceful quiet, but heavy quiet, the kind of silence that makes your own footsteps sound louder than they should. I remember checking my watch and realizing it was only mid-afternoon, but the sun was already being cut off by the cliff walls. The light started to look different, dimmer, colder. The air got cooler, too. There was this feeling, subtle at first, like we were being funneled somewhere. The trail wound deeper and deeper between the cliffs, and eventually, it just dropped into a wide clearing surrounded by rock. That's when my stomach dropped. Right across the clearing, the grass was displaced. Not trampled like hikers had passed through, but pressed down in lines and circles. There was a wide, beaten area where the grass had turned brown and flat, almost like something had been lying there repeatedly. Around the edges, there were darker patches of dirt where the grass had been ripped up completely. The ground looked disturbed, not in the way people move around, but like something big had been using that spot. At first, I tried to tell myself it was maybe elk bedding down or a bear wallow. But when I looked closer, I could see deep impressions, uneven and heavy. They weren't paw prints exactly, but they were large and irregular. Something about the way the soil was pressed down in the same direction over and over made it look unnatural. I didn't say anything out loud, but I felt that sharp tightening in my chest that only comes from instinct. We decided to move through the clearing instead of staying there. I tried to focus on walking, but I kept glancing around. Every bush, Every patch of tall grass seemed like it could be hiding something. The cliffs on both sides rose straight up, at least 60 feet, and there wasn't a way out except the way we came in or forward down the valley. Going back didn't seem appealing at the time. We still thought we were heading toward a good camping area. As we got farther down, I started noticing bones. They weren't human, thankfully, but they weren't small either. Some looked like deer, maybe elk. They were scattered in weird ways, not cleanly picked like coyotes or wolves might leave them, but torn apart, some half buried in dirt. I remember a ribcage half sunk into the soil, and beside it, what looked like a skull, cracked and hollow. It looked old, but not that old. The sun hadn't even set yet, and I already wanted to turn back. The smell hit next. It wasn't strong at first, just faint, like something dead far off. But the deeper we went, the heavier it got. It clung to the air, thick and sweet in that sick way rot smells when it's halfway gone. Felt like it was sticking to my throat. Every few steps, I could hear flies somewhere ahead, buzzing lazily. I didn't even want to see what they were on. By the time we found a flat enough spot to set up camp, the sun had dipped behind the cliffs completely. The temperature dropped fast. The wind funneled through the narrow valley, carrying that smell with it. I remember setting up my tent while trying not to look around too much. The clearing we picked was small, surrounded by jagged rocks and a few dead trees. I tried to tell myself we'd be fine for one night. When it got fully dark, everything went silent again. Not the kind of quiet you get at night in the woods. This was total stillness. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling leaves. Just wind now and then scraping through the branches. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to my heartbeat and trying not to imagine anything moving outside. Every time the wind shifted, I caught that faint smell again. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up later to the sound of something stepping on gravel. It wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. The steps were slow, uneven, like something heavy trying to move quietly. I could hear small stones rolling down as it shifted weight. Then it stopped. Total silence again. I waited, barely breathing, thinking maybe it was an animal just passing by. But it didn't move away. It just stood there. I didn't look. I didn't even unzip the tent. I just lay there frozen, trying to keep my breathing steady. I could hear my pulse in my ears. After a while, the steps started again, slow, dragging. They circled around the tent once. The dirt crunched under the weight. Then they stopped again. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I must have drifted off from exhaustion. When morning came, I stepped out, half expecting to see nothing and half expecting to see something I didn't want to. The ground around the tent had marks, deep ones. They weren't boot prints. They were wide, spaced unevenly, pressed deep like something with a lot of weight had been standing there. The direction of them led off toward the way we came from. The grass nearby was pressed flat again, just like in that clearing before. We packed up without eating. I didn't care about breakfast, I just wanted to get out of that valley. The air felt colder, and the silence followed us the whole way back. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something on the cliffs or in the trees, but there was never anything visible, just that same uneasy emptiness. When we finally reached the spot where the valley widened and sunlight hit again, I felt my whole body relax. The sound of birds came back, just faint at first, then stronger. It was like stepping back into a different world. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead. Later, back at the ranger station, I caught sight of that same ranger again. He gave us a small nod when we walked past, probably thinking we had a good trip. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't tell him about the smell or the bones or the thing that walked around our tent that night. Maybe he already knew. Thinking back now, I realized he hadn't lied. It was the coolest path, the air, the scenery, the view down that valley. But there was a reason no one else seemed to take it anymore. Maybe there hadn't been any recent attacks, but something had definitely been there once. Maybe still was. That night, when I closed my eyes in my bed back home, I could still smell that faint, rotten scent in my mind. I could still hear the slow crunch of gravel outside my tent. And even now, years later, when someone asks for the best trails in Montana, I never mention that valley. I just say there are some places that feel too quiet for a reason. When I was about 13 years old, I went to a summer camp in Massachusetts that focused on outdoor adventures. It wasn't one of those places with cabins and campfires every night. This one was built around taking older campers on real excursions, the kind where you had to carry everything on your back and hike miles through rough terrain. Each trip lasted about a week, sometimes by canoe and sometimes on foot, depending on what the counselors planned. That year, my group was scheduled for a long hike along a section of the Appalachian Trail. There were 7 of us girls, all around the same age, and 2 counselors who were barely adults themselves, maybe 19 or 20. They were responsible and confident, but looking back, I realized they were still practically kids too. It was the middle of July, humid, buggy, and hot during the day, but it cooled off fast once the sun went down. We'd been out for 3 days already, our legs covered in mosquito bites and our packs lighter as we worked through our food supply. We were all tired but in good spirits, joking around and singing under our breath as we followed the narrow dirt trail through the woods. That morning started like any other. The air was thick, and the forest felt unusually still. We had left camp early to cover some miles before the sun got too high. The woods around us were full of that deep green you only see in summer, the kind that swallows you whole. The trail wound through tall trees, their trunks straight and close together, and sometimes you could see the fog hanging in patches where the sun hadn't burned it off yet. We were maybe an hour into the day when the person in front suddenly stopped. One by one, we slowed down until everyone was standing still, looking at the ground ahead. I didn't understand at first what I was looking at. It took a few seconds to process that there was a man lying across the trail, completely naked, fast asleep. He was sprawled out right in the middle of the path like he'd just laid down and passed out there. His skin was pale and sunburned in spots, his hair greasy, his arms spread wide. He had no bag, no shoes, nothing. Just dirt and pine needles stuck to him. The counselors whispered to each other, trying to decide what to do. You're not allowed to camp directly on the trail. Everyone who hikes the Appalachian Trail knows that. It's a strict rule, partly for safety and partly to keep the trail clear. The designated camping areas are always off to the side or a bit deeper into the woods. So seeing someone asleep right there on the path was strange enough. Seeing them naked made it a whole lot worse. We carefully stepped off to the side, moving as quietly as we could, trying not to wake him. My heart was pounding. He looked like someone who had been out there a long time, too long. His skin had that leathery look from sun exposure, and there was something off about how peaceful he seemed, like he didn't care about anything around him. We managed to pass without him stirring. Once we were far enough away, everyone started talking at once, quietly and nervously, wondering what that was all about. We didn't see anyone else on the trail that day. Usually, you'd pass at least a few people going the other way, solo hikers, older couples, sometimes groups like us. But that day, there was nothing. Just the sound of our boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle in the trees. It felt like we were completely alone out there. The counselors kept checking their maps, making sure we were still on schedule, and eventually, everyone settled down again. We hiked for hours, climbing over rocks, crossing small streams, stopping for lunch near a clearing where wildflowers grew thick in the grass. The rest of the day went by quietly. By late afternoon, we reached the site where we were supposed to stay for the night. A small clearing with a few tent platforms, a fire pit, and a log bench. There was a small sign nailed to a tree marking it as an official camping area. We were all relieved to drop our packs and take a break. But the relief didn't last long. When we got to the site, someone was already there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hikers often share sites, but when I looked closer, I recognized the man immediately. It was the same guy we'd seen that morning, the one who'd been asleep and naked on the trail. Only now, he was fully dressed in ragged hiking clothes, sitting by the fire pit like he'd been waiting for us. The first thought that ran through my mind was confusion. There was no way he could have passed us. We'd been on the trail all day, and it was a long, twisting path with no shortcuts. You'd see anyone who went by. Yet somehow, he was here, already set up at the site, acting like it was perfectly normal. The counselors exchanged uneasy looks but stayed polite. They tried to keep things calm, asking him simple questions and giving him space. He seemed friendly on the surface, smiling too much, talking too casually. There was something strange in the way he carried himself, though. His eyes never quite focused on any of us. They sort of drifted around, and he kept picking at his hands as he talked. As the evening went on, he started saying odd things that didn't make sense. He said he knew the area better than anyone, that his family owned the woods, that he'd grown up here. He said he liked meeting new people out there because most hikers never came back after they passed through. The more he talked, the more uncomfortable everyone got. I remember one of the counselors went to grab the small axe that was kept at each campsite for chopping firewood. When she went to look for it, it wasn't there. We'd seen it leaning against the tree when we arrived, but now it was gone. She checked around, thinking maybe one of us had moved it, but no one had touched it. Then we noticed that the man had a small bundle of things by his side. A few knives laid out on a cloth, like he was showing off a collection. Some were clean, some looked old and worn. I don't remember seeing the axe, but it was clear he had taken it. As night fell, the woods grew darker than usual. The air felt thick and heavy. We built a small fire and stayed close to each other. The counselors tried to act calm, but you could feel their tension. Every time one of us went to fill a water bottle or move toward the edge of the site, they told us to stay close. The man lingered near the fire, talking quietly to himself when no one answered him. His tone kept changing, friendly one moment, distant the next. I barely slept that night. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to every sound outside. I could hear small movements, footsteps, twigs snapping, the crackle of the fire dying out. Once, I thought I heard someone breathing close to the tent, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination. The next morning, when the first bit of light came through the trees, the counselors got us up fast. We packed our gear as quickly as we could. The man was gone. His sleeping bag, his things, the knives, all of it had vanished. The axe was still missing. We left that campsite fast, faster than any of us had moved all week. No one said much during the hike that day. Every sound made us jump. Every crack of a branch, every bird taking off. Even though we didn't see him again, the feeling that he was still somewhere nearby didn't go away. When we got back to camp at the end of the trip, the counselors told the camp director what happened. They reported it to the park rangers, who said they'd checked the area. We never heard anything after that. No news, no confirmation that they found him or the missing axe. Years later, when I think about that trip, the image that always comes back to me isn't the hiking or the view from the ridges. It's that man lying naked on the trail like he didn't belong to the world anymore, and the way he somehow managed to be ahead of us when it was impossible for him to have passed. It made me realize how far from safety we really were out there, even with adults around. You grow up thinking the woods are peaceful, quiet, natural, harmless. But when I remember that man, the way he looked at us without really seeing us, I understand how quickly that peace can turn into something else. That night taught me more about fear than anything else in my life. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was slow, quiet, and real. Just the simple, undeniable fact that some people don't need to do anything violent to terrify you. They just have to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. A few summers ago, I took my kids camping at a state park with a lake surrounded by wooded campsites. It wasn't the kind of camping that required hiking miles into the wilderness or filtering your own water. More like drive-up camping, where you could pull your car right next to the site and unload everything within a few minutes. There were picnic tables, a fire ring, and even bathrooms a short walk away. It was comfortable enough for kids, but still felt far enough from the noise of town to remind you that you were outdoors. The day we arrived, the park was calm. The air smelled like pine needles and smoke drifting from distant fires. You could hear the quiet lapping of water against the shore and the hum of insects that never seemed to stop. We got there in the late afternoon, and the kids were excited, running around while I set up the tent and laid out the chairs. Once everything was ready, we built a small fire and cooked dinner, hot dogs, marshmallows, the usual camping food. The sky faded from blue to purple and then to black. The stars began to appear, reflected in the still water of the lake. It was the kind of night where everything felt right. The kids were laughing, sticky with melted marshmallow, and the fire crackled in front of us. I remember leaning back in my camp chair, feeling that quiet satisfaction that only comes when you're away from everything, with no schedule to worry about and nothing to distract you. Sometime after dark, a car pulled into the campsite next to ours. Their site was maybe 30 or 40 yards away, separated by a few trees and some tall grass. The headlights cut through the darkness, bright and sharp, lighting up their whole area as they parked and started setting up. It was late for someone to be just arriving, and I remember thinking they must have had a long day of travel. I couldn't see them clearly from where we sat, just their silhouettes moving through the beams of light as they unpacked. For a moment, I thought about walking over to offer help. I could tell whoever it was trying to set up a tent in the dark, and I know from experience how frustrating that can be. But between keeping an eye on the kids and the open fire, I decided it was best to stay put. Besides, most people who camp alone usually prefer to do things themselves. We stayed by the fire a while longer, talking quietly and listening to the forest settle for the night. When we finally put the fire out, the other site was still busy. I could hear soft rustling zippers and the low thud of stakes being driven into the ground. Then, after a while, it went quiet. I figured they had finished setting up and gone straight to bed. Morning came early. The air was cool and still, the kind of chill that settles in before the sun climbs high enough to warm things up. I woke up just as the first light came through the tent fabric, that soft gray-blue light that tells you it's barely dawn. I could hear the faint sounds of birds starting to move and water rippling against the shore. Then, all at once, a sound rose from across the lake that made me stop what I was doing. It was music, deep, low, and smooth, carrying perfectly over the water. It took me a few seconds to recognize it as a brass instrument, maybe a tuba or something similar. The sound was rich and full, echoing softly through the trees, blending with the morning air. It wasn't just random notes either. Whoever was playing knew exactly what they were doing. It was structured, melodic, almost orchestral. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, letting the cool air hit my face. The kids were still asleep, so I didn't wake them. The campsite was quiet except for that music, coming clear from somewhere across the lake. I walked to the edge of the water and listened. The player went through what sounded like 3 full pieces, each one lasting several minutes. It was strangely peaceful, something you'd never expect to hear out there. It filled the air with this calm, steady energy that made the world seem slower for a while. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt heavy. The birds started up again, the wind moved through the trees, and everything went back to normal. I looked over at the neighboring site, thinking they must have heard it too, but there was no movement over there. Their tent was zipped up, no sign of anyone awake yet. I just assumed they were deep sleepers. I got a new fire going to make breakfast. The smell of smoke and coffee began to fill the air, and the kids slowly woke up one by one. We talked about the music, how strange and nice it had been to hear something like that out in the middle of nowhere. As I stood over the fire cooking, I noticed movement from the site next door. A man appeared, walking slowly toward his tent, carrying something large slung over his shoulder. It took me a moment to realize what it was. A tuba. He was coming from the direction of the lake, which meant he'd been the one playing that music earlier. I remember feeling impressed more than anything. The idea of someone getting up before sunrise, hauling a heavy brass instrument out into the woods, and performing a solo concert across a quiet lake was something you don't see every day. He moved with a kind of calm, efficient rhythm, like someone who's used to doing everything alone. His clothes were clean but simple, just outdoor gear, nothing unusual. What stood out was how quickly he worked. In the time it took me to flip pancakes and get the kids settled, he had already started breaking down his campsite. His tent was halfway down, his gear packed neatly. When I finally walked over to thank him for the music, he was almost done packing. Up close, I noticed something that I hadn't seen from a distance. He only had one arm. His left sleeve was pinned neatly against his side, and everything he did one-handed. Setting up and taking down a campsite is hard enough with 2 hands. Doing it alone, one-handed, after carrying a tuba down to the lake before sunrise, was something else entirely. He didn't linger. Within minutes, his car was loaded, and he was gone. The whole process seemed impossibly smooth, as if he'd done it hundreds of times before. When he drove away, the sound of his tires on the gravel faded fast, leaving nothing but the gentle movement of the trees and the smell of breakfast still hanging in the air. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not in a fearful way, more in quiet amazement. It made me think about the kind of discipline and determination a person must have to live that way, to keep doing the things they love no matter what challenges they face. Later, as the sun set that evening, the lake was perfectly still again, and I found myself half listening for that deep sound of brass echoing across the water. But the air stayed silent, and the night went on like any other camping trip. Kids laughing, fires crackling, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. It wasn't a creepy story. Nothing bad happened, but it stuck with me because of how strange and perfect it was. A quiet campsite morning, the echo of music, and a man who managed to do something most people wouldn't even attempt. I think about it every time I go camping now. I'll be sitting by a fire, listening to the soft sounds of the woods, and I'll wonder if somewhere out there, another early riser is unpacking an instrument at dawn, getting ready to play for no one but the trees and the lake. That morning reminded me that even the most ordinary camping trips can turn into something unforgettable. Not because of fear or danger, but because of the rare, quiet beauty in watching a stranger do something extraordinary without asking for attention or applause. It's one of those small moments that never really leaves your mind, the kind you only get when you're far from everything, surrounded by stillness and paying attention. My significant other's aunt is one of those people who never stops moving. She's missing one arm, but she does more work in a day than I do in a week. She cleans houses for a living, the kind of work that never ends, with long hours and constant physical effort. And when she's done with that, she goes home and spends her time outside fixing fences, cutting wood, planting gardens, or mowing her big piece of property. She's small and quiet, but built from pure determination. The kind of person who doesn't complain, doesn't wait for help, and doesn't slow down for anyone. I've always admired her for that. Last summer, she invited us to go camping for the weekend on some land a friend of hers owned. Not a campground, just a quiet stretch of woods near a river about 2 hours from town. It wasn't totally isolated, but there were no other campers around, no designated sites, and no cell service once you turned off the main road. It was just trees, water, and open air. I hesitated at first, but she seemed so confident about it that I figured everything would be fine. She said we'd bring a couple of tents, a cooler, and some basic gear. Simple, easy camping. We drove up in 2 vehicles, her old pickup truck and my small SUV. She had her tools and a bunch of firewood loaded up, plus a few tarps, rope, and even a small hatchet. I didn't realize it until we started unloading, but she did almost everything one-handed without needing to think about it. She'd hook a rope under her elbow, brace things with her hip, and carry heavier stuff than I'd even try to lift. It was humbling to watch. She didn't ask for help or wait for someone to offer it. She just kept moving, setting up camp like she'd done it 1,000 times before. By late afternoon, the tents were up near the edge of the river, and the air had that heavy, humid stillness that always comes before nightfall. The woods on the opposite side of the river were thick, dark green, and silent, except for the sound of water moving slowly over rocks. It felt peaceful, but in that quiet, isolated way that makes you very aware of how far away you are from everything. We cooked dinner over the fire and watched the light fade out of the sky. When darkness fell, it got cold fast. The air coming off the water brought a damp chill that made the fire feel even better. We sat around for a while, just listening to the woods. You could hear small movements every now and then. Frogs, maybe a raccoon rustling through leaves, nothing unusual. Eventually, we turned in for the night. I fell asleep to the sound of the river and the soft crackle of the fire burning down. Sometime later, I woke up. Took me a few seconds to realize why. The sound of the river was still there, but everything else was gone. No bugs, no wind, no frogs, just silence. My tent felt colder, and the air seemed thicker somehow. I lay still, listening. Then I heard something faint, like a low scraping sound coming from near the fire pit. I thought maybe it was her, getting up to adjust something. She always woke up early or moved around if she couldn't sleep. But when I peeked through the flap of my tent, the fire was almost dead, just glowing embers, and I couldn't see anyone moving around it. I didn't hear the sound anymore either. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or some animal, and I eventually drifted back to sleep. When morning came, she was already up. The fire was going again, water was boiling for coffee, and she was cutting wood with her one arm like it was nothing. I asked if she'd heard anything strange in the night, but she said she hadn't. She said she'd slept fine. We spent most of the day hiking and fishing near the river. It was peaceful again. Sunny, calm, easygoing. But that night, things changed. The air felt different before the sun even went down, heavier, thicker, like a storm was building even though the sky was clear. The woods went quiet earlier than usual. By the time the light started fading, I could feel a tension I couldn't really explain. Even the river sounded different, like the water was moving slower. We ate dinner quietly, the fire popping in front of us, and I noticed she kept glancing toward the tree line across the river. After a while, she said she was turning in early. She moved like she always did, calm, steady, but there was something in her face that looked different. I stayed by the fire for a while longer, throwing on small sticks just to keep it going. The night was darker than the one before. The trees were nothing but outlines against the sky. When I finally decided to sleep, I checked the perimeter of the campsite like she'd shown me, making sure everything was packed up and no food was left out. The last thing I remember before crawling into my tent was the faint reflection of the moon on the water. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire was out and it was pitch dark. I could hear something, a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps moving through the brush. I stayed still and listened. The sound moved along the edge of the river, crunching softly, stopping, then starting again. It wasn't close enough to be right at camp, but it wasn't far either. I waited for her to say something, to move, but her tent was silent. The sound lasted for what felt like minutes. Then it stopped. I waited longer, heart pounding, barely breathing. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of the river again, and that was it. When morning came, everything looked normal, her tent, the fire pit, the river. But she was already standing near the edge of the water, staring across at the opposite bank. When I walked up to her, I noticed something strange in the mud near where she stood. Footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the wet earth. But they weren't ours. They came from the direction of the trees across the river, crossed through the shallow part of the water, and stopped right near where we stood. We didn't say much about it. She just nodded toward them and went back to work on the fire. She didn't act afraid, but I could tell she'd seen them too and understood exactly what they meant. We spent the rest of the day close to camp, keeping busy. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, listening for any sound outside. I didn't hear footsteps again, but there was a strange tension in the air that didn't go away. In the morning, she told me we were packing up early. She didn't give a reason, just said it was better to leave before the rain came, though the sky was clear. We broke everything down fast. She moved with that same quiet focus, doing more with one arm than I could manage with two. When we finally drove out of there, the woods looked exactly the same as they had when we arrived, calm, green, ordinary, but the feeling I had was different. We never talked much about that trip afterward. It wasn't a dramatic story, nothing that would sound frightening if you told it out loud. But I still think about those footprints, how they crossed the river toward our camp and stopped a few feet from where we slept. Whoever made them had stood there in the dark, close enough to see us but silent enough to go unnoticed. It wasn't about what might have happened. It was about what didn't. Knowing that someone or something had come that close and then walked away without leaving a sign beyond a few tracks in the mud. That's the kind of thing that sticks with you. And somehow the aunt never mentioned it again. She just went back to her routine, cleaning houses, working her yard, doing everything with that same steady strength. But I could tell she remembered. There's a quiet kind of toughness in people like her. Not the loud, showy kind, but the kind that knows how to survive things without talking about them. Every time I think about going camping again, I remember that night, that silence, those footprints, and I remember her. Standing there in the morning light, missing one arm, calm as ever, looking across the river like she already knew what she was looking at.